Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee, and we want to welcome you all to yet another Fun Fact Friday. As promised in last week's episode, we would continue along with other stories that showcase the relations between European settlers and the native peoples on the early American frontier. Now this particular story begins in the fall of 1743, somewhere on the stormy Atlantic, where a little child was born to a Thomas and Jane Genesee aboard the ship William and Mary. The little girl was appropriately named Mary, and although she didn't know it at the time, she was bound on a voyage with her family to the New World, wherein, upon reaching Pennsylvania, the Genesees found themselves, like many Scots-Irish settlers, moving further out west with the promise of cheap land and freedom. And finally, they settled near the Marsh Creek settlement, near South Mountain, which is in the general proximity of what is today known as Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Now, it was shortly after they arrived there that Thomas set upon the task of building a new cabin and establishing a new life for himself as well as his family. Now, in later years, Mary Genesee would recount the life that she lived with her family, albeit a rather brief one, because she mentions that although the days were filled with laborious toils, they were oftentimes superseded by the love and support of a family which now numbered around 6 children. However, by the time she had turned 15 years old, these childish and carefree days, which she described with perfect detail and glee in her later memoirs, would soon come to an end, because the French and Indian War was being waged, a bitter struggle between European powers through the English colonies and Canada. And the colonists and native peoples alike on the frontier suffered greatly, and it was on the frontier they suffered the most. In fact, it was in the year of 1758 that a party of French and Shawnees were raiding up and down the frontier near the Marsh Creek settlement, and on the morning of April 5th, they crossed over into the clearing where the Genesee homestead was, and proceeded to attack the place. Now, the 2 eldest of the boys, they managed to escape, but Mary, her parents, and the rest of the children were taken captive and led away from their home. Later that night, a discussion was held about what the raiding party was to do, because they knew that if the Continentals heard about this depredation, that they were sure to pursue. And so they decided to lighten the load to avoid the pursuing militia. Thus, a tearful Mary Genesee was separated from her family, along with a neighbor boy who had been captured previously, and they were led away. Unfortunately for the rest of the Genesees, shortly after they had passed out of hearing, well, they were killed and scalped. But Mary herself, along with the neighbor boy, was taken to Fort Duquesne, where she was sold to the Seneca people, who put her in a canoe and took her down the Ohio to their village. And it was there that they stripped her of her name, her language, and her clothes, which were thrown into the Ohio, and she was wrapped in her new identity. She was now Dagowanis, or 2 falling voices. Dagowanis took to the Seneca ways like a duck takes to water, and she not only learned the ways and the traditions and customs of the Senecas fairly quickly, but she also ended up taking to love very quickly, because she ended up marrying a Delaware man named Genesee, with whom she ended up having a child in the summer of 1761. Unfortunately, that little baby girl would pass away soon after childbirth. But before the next spring had come around, she had another child with Genesee, a little boy whom she named Thomas, in honor of her late father. That following summer, with Thomas in her cradle board, she and Genesee would embark upon a remarkable journey heading to the homelands of his people along the Genesee River near a valley called Segahunda in present-day New York. The reason being is because the French and Indian War was coming to a close, and Genesee realized there was a possibility of prisoner exchange, and if Mary Genesee or Dagowanis was so inclined, she could actually escape. But he decided to give her the option, and she decided to stay with him. And thus, for safety's sake, they decided to embark to the village of his people, Little Beardstown. And after a journey of nearly 700 miles, Degawanis arrived at the village of the Seneca people, Little Beardstown, in the dead of winter by herself. Her husband Shenanjee at one point had diverted from the little party in order to do some hunting and trapping, but unfortunately had fallen ill and passed on rapidly. Degawanis, now a widow, was a stranger in a new land. But despite this, Shenanjee's clan relatives were keen on making for her a new home in Little Beardstown, and it was there that she ended up getting right back into taking to the Seneca ways and establishing a new life for herself as well as her young son Thomas. But also she ended up falling in love again because she very quickly married a Seneca brave named Yakuto, with whom she had 6 children. It was in this time living along the Genesee River that Mary Jemison recounted with her adopted family they lived most quietly and peaceably. Unfortunately, this peace was to come to an end when the Revolutionary War broke out, and the Senecas, as well as several other tribes, had to pick sides in this continental conflict. Unfortunately, they ended up picking what would later turn out to be the wrong side, as we obviously know. We're not drinking tea at a set time every day. But the Senecas, they sided with the British. And because of this, in 1779, George Washington decided to take away their ability and their will to fight against the Continental Army by sending a force of 5,000 to the Seneca village of Little Beardstown. Now the Senecas, they heard about this in advance, and they decided to set out an ambush to prevent them from coming to the village itself. But unfortunately for the Senecas, despite the American forces suffering losses from the ambush, the Americans still made their way to Little Beardstown, where they proceeded to kill and wound many a Seneca, as well as set fire to their homesteads. But the Senecas, in a last act of defiance, managed to try and flood the fields and villages or huts which the American army had not touched, as a way of saying, well, if we can't have it, neither can you. And so they destroyed their home as a way of kind of giving a last protest to the American army. But as for Degawanis or Mary Jemison, she did not take part in any of that. She had children she had to take care of. Now her husband Yakuto, he was part of the ambush party, and rightfully so. You could not call yourself a brave or a warrior if you did not partake of the raids or the ambushes or the battles. So the women and children were left alone by themselves on many an occasion. And this was such an occasion. So what does Mary Jemison do? But she decides to go ahead and take her family south of Little Beardstown to an abandoned village called Gadaho, wherein she took up residence with 2 runaway slaves that she found upon arriving. And there she began to set up her home and return to her Seneca ways. Fortunately for her, her husband Yakuto ended up finding her, and they lived out the rest of their days, so to speak, together, at least the rest of Yakuto's days, for about 20 years. But within a few decades' time, a new white threat was coming to the Genesee and the peaceful life that had been reestablished after the revolution had come to an end. And this time, this white force which came to the Genesee Valley was not comprised of soldiers, but rather of land speculators and pioneers. And they put out a call for the Seneca people who wished to discuss and negotiate terms of surrender as well as land treaties and grants to come to the Big Tree near Genesee, New York in 1797. And although the Seneca men, the leaders of the tribe, as well as the women who would help to advise and counsel them, which was an Eastern woodland custom, they all arrived there to discuss the terms of the treaties with the white settlers. At the end of the day, very few of the people who showed up were actually satisfied with the terms of the treaty. However, Mary Jemison herself, because she fully knew and understood the English language, was able to actually go to the Big Tree delegation and, through her use of the English language, get a sizable portion of land for not just herself and her family, but for her Seneca brethren as well. And thus was established what later became known as the Gardeau Reservation, which, when it was surveyed shortly after, consisted of nearly 18,000 acres. Now, although the Senecas, for the time being, had their land in which to grow their corn, beans, and squash, the constant push and pressures of living and adapting to an increasingly white world were beginning to prove too much. In fact, the Jemison family themselves paid a very high price for this, because 3 of the Jemison boys were killed, and they were murdered between the years of 1811 to 1817. And the Jemison and Mary and Hyakato themselves, they ended up realizing that they had to make a move some way, somehow, but yet they were unwilling to move away from their Gardeau reservation. Finally, enough was too much, and the rest of the Seneca people decided to sell off the Gardeau reservation and move further out westward to what is now called the Buffalo Creek Reservation. However, before they left and moved to the Buffalo Creek Reservation, they reserved 2 square miles for Mary and her family to live on. But in this time, we see that while Mary was living in that general vicinity, a lot of different settlers, about several times, they tried to actually deprive Mary of her lands and have them taken away from her, but all of those attempts failed. For the most part, we actually see that even before the Gardeau Reservation or the Buffalo Creek Reservation was established, that Mary Jemison was well known amongst the white settlers who were living in the nearby region, and they admired her greatly. And they knew not only that anyone who came to her cabin would receive aid. If they were hungry, they were fed. If they were naked, they were clothed, as it were. But they also looked forward to the time when she would come to their homesteads and visit them for tea and cakes. So the majority of the population decided to leave her alone, and they viewed Mary, or Dagowanis, very favorably. In fact, so favorably that they took to giving her a nickname, a name that is still known throughout history today, and that is the Old White Woman of the Genesee. And because of this love and respect they had for Mary, or Dagowanis, they encouraged a doctor and writer to actually interview her and write down her memoirs, as it were. It was a narrative. And sure enough, in November of 1823, the interview took place at Whaley's Tavern. And the following year after, there was a book released to the public entitled The Life and Times of Mrs. Mary Jemison, which was quite a good seller, because it was a story not only of life on the frontier, but also a story of a woman who walked in 2 worlds. Unfortunately, we flash forward yet again, and we see that the Gardeau Reservation has been given up, and now the Senecas have moved to the Buffalo Creek Reservation in 1830. But Mary Jemison herself decided she could not live without her Seneca people, and so in 1831 she sold the title to her lands and moved to the Buffalo Creek Reservation. It was there on said reservation that Mary Jemison and Dagowanis, the 2 falling voices, were forever stilled on September 19th, 1833. In later years, about 41 years later, the Old White Woman of the Genesee would return to her valley, because at this time the Buffalo Creek Reservation had been sold off, and the burial ground was being threatened. It was then that the descendants of Mary Jemison approached a Mr. Letchworth, who lived on his Glen Iris estate of what used to be Mary Jemison's homestead, and they asked if he would be willing to surrender some of his lands to rebury their grandmother so her bones would not be disrupted. Mr. Letchworth basically looked at them and said, "How soon can you do it?" What a guy. But sure enough, Mary Jemison was disinterred from her Buffalo Creek Reservation burial site, placed in a brand new walnut coffin, and taken back to the Genesee Valley by train. And there, in what remained of the ancient council house, In a ceremony that blended the Seneca and Christian ways, she was reinterred in the valley above the Middle Falls, which she loved so well. Now, today, visitors can go to the Letchworth Park, wherein you can see a granite marker that was erected in honor of Mary Jemison shortly after her burial. In fact, at the park's museum, you can see the original headstone from her Buffalo Creek burial site in the museum today. You can also see, topping the granite marker, a statue that Mr. Letchworth had erected in memory of Mary Jemison in 1910, which depicts her, along with her baby Thomas in a cradle board, embarking upon their arduous journey to the Genesee Valley, the land she loved so well. A truly wonderful testament to a woman who lived two lives, a woman who had two husbands, a woman who walked in two worlds. Well, folks, we want to thank you so much for coming along, and we thoroughly hope you've enjoyed this episode. As always, we appreciate you following along on Facebook and YouTube. Your support is definitely appreciated. And before I go into what is coming up next, I will say some of you might not be familiar with the new format that we're posting in on Facebook. It's not anything different. It's not going to take you to a scam link or anything like that. All you have to do is click right on it. It takes you to our YouTube channel. That just helps us out with the algorithm on YouTube as far as views go. But regardless of that, folks, we hope you'll tune in for next week's episode. Now, this one will not be posted on Friday because next week there's going to be a lot going on between Thanksgiving and Black Friday. And we would be offended ourselves if someone tried to keep us away from our family for the holidays, by posting on a certain day or just taking our time and focus away. So what we're going to be doing is posting the day before Thanksgiving. And this particular episode is going to be rather interesting. I think you'll definitely enjoy it because we are going to be taking a look and exploring the truth behind the story of the first Thanksgiving. Or is it the first Thanksgiving? Well, if you want to find out the answer to that, I reckon you'll have to go ahead and tune in to next week's episode. But folks, I've already taken enough time out of your day, and I just want to go ahead and say thank you for following along, and I'll sign off for now until next week by saying this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum, signing off for now and saying goodbye and God bless.